John Wesley drew more attention for more societies and was banned from more Anglican pulpits. At Bristol, Wesley began field preaching and established the first Methodist meeting place.
Yes, the very first Methodist property is in Bristol, and it's an amazing place to visit. The pulpit can only be reached from the balcony. It was designed that way so that if people got upset at the preacher, because the Methodist preachers created disturbances in Bristol by resisting the slave trade, for example, and Bristol being a port was a place where the slave trade was very integrated into the life of the city, and so pushing back against the slave trade in Bristol was a dangerous thing to do. But when you go in the new chapel, this first Methodist building, there are no windows on the ground floor. The windows are higher, again, to protect the people who are worshiping and to protect the preacher. The building is designed so that people will be safe there, and hecklers and egg throwers and rotten tomato throwers would not be able to assault the preacher very easily.
I traveled to Bristol to talk with David Weeks, chaplain of John Wesley's chapel, also known as the New Room.
New Room is the oldest Methodist chapel in the world. John built it because when he was meeting with the religious societies in Bristol, that was sort of groups of enthusiastic Christians who were a bit worried about the state of the church at the time. They met in rented rooms, and very often they were so crowded in them that he feared the sort of floor would collapse. So he decided they needed a new room for them to meet in. And so that was the beginning of this building, 1739.
Not allowed to preach in Anglican churches, Wesley began field preaching, speaking out of doors to large crowds.
Yeah, I mean, John did because it was the first place where he ever did open-air preaching. I mean, that was the thing. That was where I think he discovered what really his purpose was. He came at the end of March in 1739, and on the Sunday he went with George Whitefield 3 different places in the city and saw George preaching in the open air. I think he was a bit embarrassed by it. He felt in a way the right place to preach was in church, and doing it in sort of broadcasting it just in the open to anybody who wanted to listen. There was something not quite right about it. But he was so persuaded that the next day he began to preach in the open air himself. I think George had already fixed it up, and probably it was in the press already to say he would be doing it. That was George Whitefield's way of persuading people to do things, advertise it in the press, and then tell them that was the way of it. And so John did, and I think he was just staggered with the response of people, particularly out to the east of Bristol, where there was the Kingswood Forest, which was a mining area, where there were no churches at all, where the people had been really ignored by the church, a bit feared by the city, because being miners, they were a fearsome lot. And he was just amazed at the response. So for the rest of his life, that was what he did.
Wesley made his way up and down the coast at Bristol, traveling on horseback.
Very much so, yes. I mean, it was his way of going around the country. In this way, he was very Pauline. You know, Paul moved around, telling people the good news, gathering them into small groups, and then off he went. John did exactly the same. He would come here to Bristol, and he began the society, but then he would move on. And he moved on and moved on, all the time founding societies, but keeping in touch with them, both by visiting them the next year or maybe the year after, also through letters and such like. So he travelled on horseback. That was the easiest way to do it. He found he could read easily when he was on horseback. The horse, he felt, knew the way better than he did, so he didn't have to worry about that. He travelled about 250,000 miles on horseback during his lifetime. It was only later, when he was in his 70s, they persuaded him, in fact, to use a chaise, rather than continuing on horseback all the time. He also felt it was healthy. Remember